Chris wants no part of that.
Is it recording now? Okay, good. Okay. Before I launch into this, how is the program coming?
Stressful? Exhausting?
Is it by any chance rewarding?
Extremely.
Some of it's rewarding, yes.
And I am not that.
No, yeah. All the classes are rewarding, and all the classes are challenging.
So what part of it is not rewarding?
I think some of the, like, some of our use of time seems like overburdened with some stuff that's not less rewarding.
Remember, I'm recording everything. So, do you want me to stop the recording and then you can talk? All right, so let's roll. Communications on the part of the central bank is a relatively recent development in economics. Let me show you the way central bank use, the Federal Reserve used to communicate. I'm gonna make this big in the pages and what you're seeing here is the very first press release of the Federal Reserve regarding the decisions to modify loans. This was done in 1996. Okay. Just take a look to what it says. It announced the following two actions. The first one is there is an action on something called the discount rate. You know what the discount rate is? Or Chris, do you know what the discount rate is? Ben, you know what the discount rate is? If you don't know, it's not a big deal, but I just... Vivian, you know what the discount rate is?
I'm assuming that it's the signal that we saw. I'm not sure.
No, it's not a Sigma thing. No. Pete?
I believe it's the rate that the Federal Reserve charges banks on loans. When banks want to come to the Fed for money, it's the rate that they're charging them for the interest on it.
Correct. So the way it works is that, say that you're a business and you extend credit to a producer. And then the way you were able to extend credit to that producer is because you had a bank that extended credit to you. And so now the bank has a piece of paper that says that you owe me. There are times when the banks can then turn around and sell that piece of paper to the Federal Reserve. The discount rate is the rate that the Federal Reserve applies to that price in order to extend credit to that bank. It used to be called the rediscount rate. It has not played much of a role since the financial crisis, partly because the discount rate is 0. And so it is not a big deal now. It may be a big deal down the road. Now, the second thing that it says in here is that the committee agreed to lower the federal funds rate. Notice the choice of words. This is expected, and just to reduce the federal funds rate by about 25 basis points. So it is not, unlike the discount rate, which is under the control of the Federal Reserve, the federal funds rate isn't. Federal funds rate is the rate at which banks transact among themselves. When Citibank borrows from Bank of America, the rate at which that transaction is taking place is the federal funds rate. The discount rate, and so therefore is market determined. The discount rate is an entirely different affair. It is the rate at which the Federal Reserve decides to charge the central bank. So notice that there is a little hedging in the choice of words for the federal funds rate, but not for the discount rate. Then there are some pathetic words about what the economy is doing. There's this growth, there's this inflation, and then it says which Federal Reserve banks approve that decision. So this is what we did. This is what we think is going forward. This is who agrees and who disagrees. Nothing more. All right? This seemingly lame press announcement was revolutionary at the time. It was the first time that the Federal Reserve said what it was going to do. It expressed a view about the economy going forward. And then it said who disagree or agree with that decision. Let's move about, what, 28 years forward. And this is what we now have. Before I go the thing by thing, just check it out. It's 2 full pages. And so now there seems to be a need to talk. The first thing is that this in highlight here, it says now that the Federal Reserve, it is indicating what its goals are. The other one didn't. The other one said, yeah, there's growth. There's growth, there's inflation. Next. Now they are unambiguous about what they want. The second thing that it's saying here, notice, is it is unambiguously stating what the target inflation rate is. The previous one didn't. The previous said there's inflation, we try to contain it, but if you were to ask them, well, contain it to what level, or how do you know that when you're successful, or when will you declare victory? They couldn't tell you, or they didn't tell us. And so now they're saying that they don't want the inflation rate to be running persistently below 2%. Then they launch into a fairly detailed explanation about their decisions and how they're going to go about it. So you notice that in the first one, they says that we agree to target the federal funds rate to about 5 percentage points, and that's somehow it's going to work in the reserve markets. And we just trust the invisible hand to come and do this for us. Or we're just going to have a talk to the Holy Ghost, and he's going to solve the thing for us. Now, immediately, now there's no magic. Right? Now they're telling us, and we're going to do this, and we're going to we're going to reduce the pace at which we are buying securities from the open market. We're going to tell you not only what we're buying, we're telling you also what we're buying. We're buying U.S. Treasury securities, and we're buying mortgage-backed securities. None of this, not even the closest thing was available in 1996. In 1996 is, you trust us. Okay, we know what we're doing. Don't worry about it. Sit, relax. It's a long trip. Okay? Then it tells us more about what they're going here. And here is, once again, where they unambiguously state what their goals are, just in case we missed them the first time. Now, so there's maximum employment and price stability. And it is now saying that it is committed to maintaining an accommodative monetary policy, or in less jargonistic, it is committed to expanding the money supply so as to keep the federal funds rate at this level. And the next thing that it's going to do, once again, notice, then there is unambiguous statement about what the inflation rate is. The target inflation rate is 2 percentage points. Once again, in case we missed it 2 times in a row, it is stated again. So notice how they are just making sure that we know that the target inflation rate is 2%. And then they tell us who voted. Notice that they're not saying now Dallas or New York. Now they're saying names. And so in the previous one, it was Cleveland, St. Louis, Dallas, Atlanta, San Francisco, all of them went alone. Now it's different. Now they're saying so-and-so did. And it is also saying for the people that dissent, it's saying why they are dissenting. All right. Now, let me just begin the annoyances. Why would these guys go out of their way, literally, to keep telling us that their inflation target is 2%? Ivan. I mean, is it not kind of boring looking that, you know, it's 2%, it's 2%. And, oh no, it's 2%. So, why would they keep saying this to us?
To ensure that inflation expectations are at 2%.
Nail. Exactly nail. So when you have that Phillips curve that says inflation equals expected inflation rate plus some parameter times the unemployment gap, how is it that these inflationary expectations are formed? Well, we can just be looking at each other and say, Ivana, what do you think the inflation rate is going to be? And she says, 3. And then I ask Pete, well, what do you think it's going to be? What? Then I ask Grace, she says 8. Okay? And rather than having a diversity of inflationary expectations, the central bank says, we're going to do that. Now, the next question that arises is, why do you think, not just Ivana, why do you think that the central bank can say our target for the inflation rate is 2%? And why don't they say that our target for the unemployment rate is 5? Why would they pick the inflation rate and not something that is tangible? So Sergio.
That is their actual objective, right?
Yeah, but they don't tell you a number. They say something about maximum employment. Well, what the hell is that? I need a number. Now, they say it to us about the unemployment rate, I mean about the inflation rate, but they don't say it for maximum employment. Is that, what unemployment rate is that? Why would they say, what would be so unambiguous about one and not the other? I mean, it is not that difficult to put a number on a piece of paper, right? And so, why would they say that? Ariel. Not comfortable?
Well, I think part of it has to do with because the inflation is linked to monetary policy. More people can see the link between inflation and monetary policy and supply. That it's easier to say we're going to target inflation rather than giving them employment that's more tangible.
So it's laziness on their part.
Maybe a little bit.
Oh. Rohan.
Maybe because maximum employment is sort of a moving target, and like I understand that they want to target an absolute level for inflation.
Or why don't you target an absolute value for the unemployment rate? You say, is it really that hard to write it down? Like, insert. Our objective for the inflation rate is 2%. Our objective for the unemployment rate is 5.5. Pick a number, but a number has to be picked. Koshu.
I think they believe that inflation rate is ultimately determined only by monetary policy. However, employment is determined by external factors. And they've explained that the recession has moved the maximum unemployment point. And so if they quantify at one point, they need to keep on changing it. As Rohan said, it's the target basically moves according to the economic situation, and therefore they can't really quantify it.
Perfect. I'm not so persuaded by the idea that it is difficult to say that let's target an unemployment rate of X% on account of the changes in the potential output. Because I could make a comfortable argument to say, well, now the United States is an open economy, therefore the inflation target has to be changed on account of that openness. The idea is this, and I think we went over it in the beginning. The objectives of the central bank is ultimately inflation. They recognize that inflation is a monetary development. That they cannot change the level of economic activity as a target. Remember the natural unemployment rate, that's for the purposes of macroeconomics, it's a biblical given. It's natural. The central bank cannot change that. And whenever the central bank tries to go below the natural rate, it always ends up with more inflation and the same unemployment rate. So the central bank cannot permanently move or change the level of economic activity. It can change it temporarily, but not permanently. The central bank can change the level of the inflation rate permanently. It can either be 2 or 4. Okay. Are we okay now? Now, let's continue with the barrage of annoying questions here. So check this. Let's see if you, where is it? Yeah, so here we go. So currently, the federal funds rate is between 0 and 25 basis points, Exhibit A. Exhibit B is that the target inflation rate is, let's just call it 2%. So what is the real rate right now, according to this, for the real federal funds rate? It's one minus the other. It's not a complicated calculation. It's the nominal rate minus the expected inflation rate. And the central bank is telling us what the expected inflation rate is 2%. So what is the real federal funds rate? Jason.
Negative 2 to 1, negative 1.75.
It's negative. And then the question that arises from that is, if the real interest rate is negative, why is it that economic activity is not increasing? And that's a more difficult question, and I don't know the answer to that. But you see the tension, right? On the one hand, we're targeting the inflation rate of 2 percentage points, and on the other hand, the current nominal rate is about 0. So that implies that the real rate is negative. Fine. But if the real rate is negative, then how come economic activity is not expanding? Is the puzzle more or less clear, Alexander? I'm not asking for the answer. I'm asking, is the tension clear?
Yeah.
Okay. But when you say, or when I say, if the real interest rate is not expanding, I'm sorry, the real rate is negative, and economic activity is not expanding. It's not expanding relative to what? Relative to the previous period? Relative to which benchmark? Relative to what reference point? Koshu? Am I making sense?
Yeah. Potential output.
It's relative to what would have happened in the absence of that negative real interest rate. So it is relative to something that we do not see. In other words, had the real interest rate been positive, the economic situation would have been a lot worse. Wait, no markers. Now you're paying a lot of money for this, right? Maybe we got no markers. So,
There's one in the other room.
what is you have markers?
No.
Are you gonna go and get them? This is an important point. We're always making a statement, whether we acknowledge it or not, or relative to something. Okay? So I'm going to show you in a minute what I mean by this.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
You said it's relative to the rate it would have been, like positive interest rate, is that correct?
You want maybe I misspoke. So, oh, no doubt I misspoke. Thank you very much. What I tried to say is that the current real interest rate is negative. And that's because they say that the federal funds rate is going to be at most 25 basis points, Exhibit A, and Exhibit B, the target inflation rate is 2%. So I'm going to call that the expected inflation rate. So the difference between the two of them is going to be the real rate. Right now, as Jason noted, let's just call them -2. given that, then the next question that I ask is, how come their economic activity is not expanding? Okay? Now, that's what I have said so far, or what I meant to say so far. So what, given that, what is your question?
I'm not sure now. Well, you said it's not expanding in relations to what?
That's where I'm headed now.
Okay. I'll let you go there.
I'm gonna put here the real rate. And I'm gonna put here the unemployment rate. The question that arises, or the tension that normally arises, is that given that the real rate, just put -2, given that the real rate is negative, you would have expected, or the textbooks tell us, that if the real rate is negative, that's going to expand consumption, expand investment. Both of these guys are going to expand output, and that in turn is going to lower the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate has declined a little, but with a negative real interest rate, one may be thinking that it should have declined like more. The next question is relative to what? Because if I say it should have declined by more, and I don't tell you relative to what, well, then I'm not saying much, really. All I'm saying is that cloud looks like a duck, or I don't like that, or that cloud looks like a barking dog. Fine. So it doesn't have any, to me, any persuasive value. Now comes the really tricky part in the line of work that we have, is that there is, so when somebody says the unemployment rate should have declined by more, they have something like this. But they don't, this is U alternative 1. They don't tell you what this is. They probably have in mind this, because otherwise saying it should have declined by more is not exactly all that informative. The problem is that they don't tell you what this alternative is. And so when, my sense is that when we try to say that monetary policy is or is not effective, or fiscal policy is not or is not effective, there needs to be a reference point. Okay? The reference point that I think is currently in place is not this, but this. That in the absence of a negative real interest rate, the unemployment rate would have been higher than what it currently is. And that therefore, well, this is the decline or the effectiveness of monetary policy by keeping the real interest rate negative. The glitches, we don't know what this alternative is either. And so that is the problem that we now have, that the alternatives that might have been available to judge the effectiveness of monetary policy are not available for us to see. If all of you have headaches, and then I were to say, I know how to fix this, and then I go around and I give Mauricio 1 Advil, I give Pitt 2 Advils, I give Megan 4 Advils, and I wind up with them giving 8 Advils. Then I have a reference point, 1, 2, 4, 8. And I can go and measure how long does it take for the headache to go away. We don't have this opportunity to experiment in the economy. And so there is always this alternative that we are using to judge what we're doing, when we don't get to see it. I cannot ask every 5 minutes to Mauricio, is the headache gone? Well, more or less. Pete, I'm fine. Megan, I'm gone. Jeff, call me later. Right? 8, 4, 2, 1. We don't see the alternatives in macroeconomics because we don't have experimentation. And that is where we are now. All right? So keep that in mind. Okay, so for guys who make a living out of this, every choice of words conveys a particular intention on the part of the central bank. All right. Now take a look to this objection. Blosser is saying that Blosser objected to the guidance indicating that it likely will be appropriate to maintain the current target rate for the federal funds rate for a considerable time after the asset purchase program ends. So what you're seeing now is just the last bubble of a probably very heated discussion as to what it means considerable time. Is it 2 weeks, 2 months, 6 months? What's meant? They talked about what considerable amount of time is. They don't tell us. And so that's the ambiguity that we're now facing. All right. 1996, the economy is fine, this is what we did. See you next month. Currently, we're telling you just about everything that we see is happening, how we're gonna modify monetary policy, who disagree and why that disagreement took place. And so what I want to do today is to provide a little structure to this change and then illustrate the genesis of it, okay? Of the change between 1996 and 2004. So the way I title this, there are no slopes. It's not that the IS schedule is flat or that the indifference curve is touching the Phillips curve at this angle. That's gone. There are no t-tests. That's gone too. You're not going to see a word about it. Not a word about it from me. You're not going to see anywhere in this press release something indicating we believe that the indifference curve, our difference curve, is now tangent to the Phillips curve. So we're going to declare victory because otherwise it will be an incentive to cheat. Now, they say that to us, we know exactly what they mean, but they don't say that to us. Or that we have conducted a bunch of statistical tests and have found that that Phillips curve thing that people are enamored with, that's crap. Inflation does not depend on unemployment rate. And so we have to go and revise. You're not going to see any of it. It's just talk and talk, talk. And then when we're done, we talk more. And that's what we are now into. All right, so let's roll. So central banks have changed significantly from being obscure to seeking transparency. It's not that the central banks are particularly enamored with the idea of transparency. It means work. It means that you have to keep track of every word that you say because somebody in the country is going to say, oh, but you said 2 months ago this and now you change your mind. Why? So they have to always keep tracking of this. More importantly, central banks are now considerably more independent. Independent means, has different meanings. In the United States, it means independent from the executive branch. So the President of the United States or Treasury cannot tell the Federal Reserve what to do. They just can't. The same way that the President or Treasury cannot tell the Supreme Court, you have to rule in this particular way. Congress, however, can tell the Federal Reserve what to do. And so independence is not like go ahead, tell us about it, good luck, send a postcard. The Federal Reserve is independent of the executive branch, not of Congress, okay? And so that's what this means by accountability. Accountability is that the Federal Reserve goes twice a year to Congress, at least twice a year, and testifies about developments that have taken place and what are going to be the next step. You would think that this simple act of letting the country know what the hell is going on with the money would have been in place for the very beginning. Not true, and not true in the United States. So the next time, this is gonna be a little snarky, the next time that you see just pull a dollar bill and look for these wonderful words, in God we trust. In God we trust, because from what I can tell, the Federal Reserve doesn't tell us anything. I mean, this is before they were doing this. Now we don't trust anyone, including God. Okay, so the next thing is, so the first reason why they switch from barely telling us what they're doing to telling us everything they're doing and how they're doing it is a reflection of accountability. The second thing is that, and this is what Ivana just mentioned, they want to have individuals form expectations about inflation. And what they don't want is for the process of forming inflationary expectations to unravel. Let me give you an example of what unraveling is. Suppose that I believe that Alexander is the guy who knows the most about inflationary expectations. I have my view about it, but I want to check. So Alexander, do you think that the inflation rate is going to be 2%? I'm making up the number. And he says, no, I think it's going to be about 8%. Now I'm second guessing in my mind. Maybe he has a point. Maybe he's seeing something that I'm not seeing. So you don't quite adjust all the way. So you say, well, let's split the difference, so it's 6 points, so I'm going to go with 5. Then I ask Koshu, have you talked to Alexander? And he says, he's completely crazy, right? Or worse. And so the problem that arises is that if Koshu says Alexander doesn't know what he's talking about, is far higher than 8, is 18, then I need now to go and revise my inflationary expectations even more. And the question is, when will this process end? Well, by itself doesn't have a tendency to end. And that's what we mean by saying inflation expectations are anchored. So think about a ship and think about an anchor. So the anchor goes to the ground and the ship can move around only one, it is not gonna go far. That is what the Federal Reserve, that is what every bank, every central bank that is targeting inflation rate wants. Wants for us to assume or to give the credibility to the central bank that when they say it's 2%, it will be 2%. Remember the tension that the central bank can say, well, it's gonna be 2%, and then they have an incentive to cheat. And so what we need now is to impose some behavioral rules on the central bank. So just the central bank uttering the word 2%, you said, you can say 2 or 200, I don't care, I don't believe anything you say. Okay? That's why we have generated this infrastructure for the central bank to say something and for that something to be credible. Okay. Why are these guys doing this? Well, one is they want inflation expectations to be targeted, and they also let us know about what is coming up, what are the objectives of the central bank. One possibility for this is to tell us what the central bank's strategies are. In the recent FOMC statement, they're telling us that they're going to be buying less from the open market, and they're telling us exactly of what type of securities they're going to be buying. So that's their strategy. They're telling us that the economic outlook doesn't look all that great, but it doesn't look that crappy either. So we're just modeling through. And finally, they tell us the outlook, the monetary policy outlook, and that is to keeping the federal funds rate at between 0 and 25 basis points. So this is part of what we just did. What are the goals? Well, consistent with the statutory mandate, the committee seeks to maintain maximum employment, which they leave fairly vague, fairly subjective, and price stability. What is the strategy? The strategy is that it's going to reduce the pace of these asset purchases. And what is the outlook? The outlook is that the central bank will maintain for some time the federal funds rate low. Sometime is fairly vague. So when they say that we're trying to be transparent, to me that sounds to me they're not being transparent. Because the moment you say I want to be transparent, then I demand an exacting standard. Sometime is as vague as you can put it in the English language. And it isn't, I don't know what that means. And I don't know what anyone else will know what that means. All right? And so I just don't, so in the name of transparency, they have managed to produce ambiguities. And I don't particularly like that all that much. Okay, so what are the things that the central banks, or how do they anticipate creating information? Well, the first thing is that they like to create what's called news. So, for example, you can imagine that if we were expecting the inflation rate to be 3% or 4%, and they tell us, well, you can think anything you want, what we're going to do is to target an inflation rate of 2%, then we are, in effect, changing the distribution of the inflation rate. So we just shift the entire distribution. In the case of the nominal rate, if we were thinking that the nominal rate was going to be 2 percentage points in January of 2015, then by that little statement that sometime they're enabling us to shift the distribution, the entirety of it, close to zero. So what the central bank, in what we call creating news, what is seeking to do is to change expectations. All right? That's the first thing, create news. The second thing is that the Federal Reserve, or the goals of communications, are about reducing the noise. So let's talk about, let me just be specific, and then we talk about other examples. So the idea here is that they're not changing the expected value of the variable. What they're doing is reducing the variance around it. Okay? And so in this case, they just make it considerably more likely for the inflation rate, the expected inflation rate, to be what they say. And the same thing for the interest rate. Now imagine that instead of having the inflation rate, imagine that instead of having either the inflation rate or the interest rate, we're going to have the distribution of the time that it takes for the federal funds rate to increase. Okay. Let's see, Matthew. This is what all the questions that I'm about to ask are unfair. Okay, so no problem if I don't, if you don't feel comfortable. No problem. Okay. Okay. Good. So I want to talk about the sometime. What do you think they mean when they say sometime? Do you think they mean 1 month, 4 months, 6 months? Remember, it's an unfair question, so any number will do.
I think they don't know either. It's like I tell my friend like I will call it back later.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. So, but I want to know when, right? So,
Like 3 months.
3 months. Let's put 3 months. So let's measure this in months. Lexi?
6 months.
Megan?
2 months.
Let's, for the sake, so you can see that we don't have agreement among ourselves, right? So let's say for simplicity that I'm going to, and suppose I ask everyone here, what do you think, 2, 3, 6? And suppose that I now arrive at this type of distribution. So let's say that most of us agree that it was gonna be 3 months, but that there was a fair amount of disagreement among ourselves, whether it was 2 or 6, all right? Am I making sense so far? Now, the Federal Reserve comes and said, we're going to be maintaining the low interest rate for some time, for no more than 4 months. How will you change the distribution? So you will do something, you can maintain that it's gonna be 3 months, but now you are removing definitely 6 months out of the show, right? So let's just put 4 there, and then we do this, right? That's noise reduction. We all still agree that it may be 3 months, but the Federal Reserve just told us that it's not gonna be more than 4 months. And so that's what the role of noise reduction is. All right. Now, this part in here is going to spill over to what we're going to do in the subsequent segment. And it has to do with unconventional monetary policy. Okay? And so I'm going to do this. I'm going to make references to something that we haven't seen yet, so that when we go to the unconventional monetary policies, we're going to be referring back to this. There's something called the term structure of treasury yields or interest rates. The idea is that an interest rate a treasury bond of 10 years is going to have a higher yield than a treasury bill of 1 month. And if you were to arrange the yields by their term, by how long they are, you generate something called the term structure in here. Okay, so think of this as the yield. The shorter the maturity, the smaller the yield. So a treasury bond that is supposed to last 30 years will have a higher yield than a treasury bill that is supposed to last 1 month. Okay? What we do is we use something called the expectation theory of the term structure. And so think about this as a long-term rate. R, so uppercase R as a long-term rate, 10 years, 30 years. And the question that what this theory postulates is that that's related to the short-term rate. How? So this is going to be what we call the term premium. Has a component that is known, alpha, and a component that is noise. We don't know. So we just put there a random term just to avoid creating the impression that we know what we're talking about. And so we put that random term in there. This is the big component, this thing there. Okay? This is the expected value of the short rate in the future. So what do I expect the short rate to be a year from now? What do I expect the short rate to be 2 years from now? What do I expect the federal funds rate to be 2 years from now? So this is the short rate. This is what I expect that short rate to be. And the expression is the mean of those expectations. Okay? Did that make sense? David? Jason? Jason's there. Jeff? Pete? Mauricio? So if I were to ask you today, what do you think is gonna be the federal funds rate a year from now? You say 1%. I'm making up the number. How about 2 years from now? 2%. 3 years, 3%. You take the average of those numbers, and that then is this term. Okay? Jason?
Shouldn't it be compounded?
What Jason is no. Why don't you go here to the board and show me that compounding thing? Or that board, if you feel better at that board. What he's saying is the following. Suppose that you invest for 1 year, and then you take the proceeds and you invest that again for 2 years. Or you can do it there if you want.
So I guess start off with principal. And from this one would be from period say T0 to 1. And then this T period 1 to 2 and so on until 1 plus 9 to 10, and this whole thing, I think there's some AER formula right, compounded.
Yeah, okay. You see what he's doing? He's saying that the interest rate, the long-term interest rate that you want to earn today has to yield a principal at the end of 10 years that it is the same as that. Okay? In other words, you have two choices. You invest today for 10 years, or you invest 1 year at a time. And at the end, you want to be indifferent between the two. Correct? Okay. So now what I want you to do is to assume that the principal equals 1. Okay? So just put 1 in there. Yeah, that's it. The next thing that I want you to do is to take the log of that product of interest rates.
So it would be log.
It will be the sum of those logs.
Yeah.
Perfect. The next thing that I want you to do is to invoke the approximation that the log of 1 plus the interest rate is about the interest rate. It's about the same as the interest rate. Well, no, you got somehow, right?
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Right. I want you to take the log of this.
Yeah.
It's going to be 1 over n, right? Or, well, this is the same interest rate, right? So this is,
Oh, okay, yeah.
look at the rest of there. The interest rate. That's it. And so what he's noting to us is that that expression there works so long as the interest rates are sufficiently close to 0 or sufficiently small that the log of 1 plus the interest rate is the interest rate. Okay? Now, oh, wait, there's another thing. Why don't you rewrite that expression for a moment? But don't put the actual interest rate, put the expected value of the interest rate, right? Right. So it is not that we know what the interest rate is going to be in the future, it's that we're making an expectation of it. We don't have in here the actual interest rate, we have in here the expected value of that interest rate. And so that has a way of making the problem a little more complicated. So the answer to Jason is yes, it should be compounded. The follow-up answer is we don't want to deal with that multiplication all the time. So what we have to do is to think about ways of making it simple for us. Okay? All right, thank you. Now, check this. Let me make sure that I'm not saying about this. Okay. What do you think when the Federal Reserve says that they want the interest rate to be between 0 and 0.25 for a considerable amount of time? What value would you assign to this? The Federal Reserve is telling you what value to assign to it. Patrick, where are you? What value would you assign to it?
I think, according to the interest rate for now, should we expect?
No, what I want is a number for this expectation. Pete, what number? I mean, they're telling us what the number is. They're saying 0. They're saying we're going to make sure that the interest rate, the federal funds rate, remains at 0 for the foreseeable future. And so we, the guys in charge of making sure that we're going to be able to lend at the right rate, we go and set this to 0. So you see how now the communications policy is not just about being cute and being precise. Now it's affecting the long-term interest rate. Chris, did that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Sharjil, did that make sense?
Yes.
All right. Grace, am I making sense to you? Alexander? Kenji? Dimitri is all the way in the back, my left. Am I making sense to you?
Yes.
Is this confusing to anyone? This is an expression that it is used to determine the long-term interest rate. It has two components. One, something that we call the term premium. Two, the arithmetic average of future expectations of the short rate. The central bank tells us what those future interest rates are going to be, and we go and set it to 0, because that's when it told us. So now comes not just a matter of language, now comes why the ambiguity on the part of the central bank matters. Suppose that we disagree on how long this term is going to be 0. Now, if we start thinking that it's going to be 0, in the little example that we have there, say 2 months, I think, Lexi, you were the one with a 2 month deal, or?
No, that was me.
Who said 2 months? Anyway, so you said 2 months. Pete didn't say it, but let's assume that he said 3 months. Suppose now that we're now beginning to realize that the central bank is not going to be able to maintain this for a substantial period of time, and we start thinking that it is going to be 2 months. What would we do to this term? What's going to happen to that term? Peter.
If we assume it's 2 months, it's going to stay between 0 and 2.5, then I guess.
Let me just go here. Right now, this is it in the United States for monetary policy. This is the show. So let me just. these are months. The Federal Reserve is telling us that it's going to be doing this, and it's going to maintain the federal funds rate at 0 for the next 5 months. And we go and said, okay, so we think it's going to be 0 too. Okay? For some time. And so I'm defining some time to be 5 months. And therefore the mean is 0. And therefore I'm just going to put 3. All right? Are we okay with this? Okay. I want now for us to start second guessing what the Federal Reserve is saying about this 5 months. And suppose that we anticipate or we revise our inflation, our expectations of the short-term rate, or that the central bank at one point says, well, it is true that we've been a little vague about the some time, but what, we're just gonna stop this here. So this is what we mean by some time. Starting there, the interest rate is going to increase. And let's just put in here 1 and 1. So they're revised, they now made precise the definition of sometime. Sometime means just 3 months. What's going to, so this is 5 months into the future. What's going to happen to the long-term rate now today?
Increase.
It's going to increase, Ron?
Yeah.
It's going to increase, and if it increases, so what? Then economic activity declines, because it's going to be more expensive to borrow. So if the long-term rate increases, borrowing to buy a house is going to be more expensive, we buy less of it. Borrowing to set up a factory is going to be more expensive. So what? So economic activity declines, so what? So the unemployment rate increases. So you see how the choice of words sometimes has these ramifications, or how the central bank wants to steer the economy between low inflation and high unemployment or something else. So the moment the central bank chooses to be unambiguous about what sometime means, so if it's going to say, we're going to do this after 3 months, then everybody goes and revises their expectations about what the short-term rate is going to be in the future. That raises the long-term rate today, not in the future, today. And that tanks economic activity today. About a year ago, Chairman Bernanke made a statement about for how long was the asset purchases going to be kept. It became known as the tapering effect. It was a reporter asked a question and he casually answered. That was understood as putting a deadline on for how long they were going to be purchasing. That was understood as saying sometime means 6 months. And beginning 6 months, all these interest rates, the short-term rates are going to increase. Therefore, the long-term rate increase right there and then. And so the choice of words sometime is really crafted to avoid the long-term rate to increase. It's not that they don't know and we just, well, there is disagreement among ourselves. It's that the moment they are explicit about what that means, the short-term rate will increase. They are concerned about the employment effects of this increase. Therefore, they don't want to be so precise now. So this is what we just went over. Also check this. This is well. Let's ask. Check this out. An extended period of time. want, Kenny, I want you to compare the following choice of words. An extended period of time, sometime.
Okay.
Which of these two is longer to you?
The extended period.
And so this was in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
In June of 2009. This is about almost a year after Lehman Brothers collapsed. This is probably the height of the financial crisis in the United States. So what are these guys saying? Are likely to warrant exceptionally low levels of the interest rate, of the federal funds rate, for an extended period of time. An extended period of time was meant to convey as far as I can see into the future. Meaning that the Federal Reserve wanted for all the guys into the long-term market to set that interest rate, that expected interest rate, to zero, so that they could then lower the long-term rates. They have shifted the language a little now by saying sometime. So now it's not an extended period of time. It's not 2-3 years. It's going to be at most, I mean, the way I would understand that would be at most 1 year. And so now you're seeing the long-term rates rising in the United States because extended was updated or upgraded to sometime. All right. Well, you remember when I was talking about the I don't understand why I cannot get this thing cut. Fine. Do you remember when I was talking about the Phillips curve, the difference curve, and the central bank makes us a promise about the inflation rate being zero, and then I said, and then the central bank realizes there has an incentive to cheat and then goes and cheats. What exactly is preventing the central bank from doing this now? What exactly is preventing the central bank from saying, yeah, it's going to be sometime, but sometime we meant 15 minutes, and so we're going to raise the interest rate now? What gets in the way of that happening? What forces, what compels the central bank to maintain this promise? We're going to do that in the unconventional monetary policy. You're going to see here that the very actions of the central bank have a built-in shelling type structure. When the central bank goes and expands the money supply the way it did in here, that act created mechanisms that prevent the central bank from undoing it. Okay? All right, and see what's in here. Okay, so why don't we take a break and then I'll tell you all about the rest of this. Do you mind turning off the